Have you ever noticed something strange? A narcissist can control people for years. They can manipulate, gaslight, intimidate, confuse, and emotionally exhaust almost everyone who enters their life. Yet every once in a while they encounter someone different, someone who doesn't play by the usual rules, someone who sees through the illusion, someone who refuses to become another source of validation, someone who seems impossible to control. And suddenly, the narcissist begins to unravel. The strange part is that this person is often not the loudest, not the most aggressive, not the most powerful. In fact, they're frequently one of the most compassionate people in the room, a super empath. Now, before we continue, it's important to understand something. A super empath isn't simply someone who cares deeply. Many people are empathetic. Many people are kind. Many people are sensitive. But a super empath is different. They possess empathy, but they also possess awareness, strength, boundaries, emotional intelligence, and most importantly, they eventually stop allowing their compassion to be used against them. That's when everything changes. Because narcissists thrive in environments where empathy is unprotected, where kindness lacks boundaries, where compassion becomes self-sacrifice. But when empathy learns how to defend itself, it becomes something entirely different, something the narcissist never expected, something they often fear. And that's exactly why the relationship between a narcissist and a super empath becomes one of the most fascinating psychological battles you'll ever witness. The first way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by refusing to react emotionally the way the narcissist expects. This may sound simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Most narcissists rely on reactions. They need them: attention, validation, fear, anger, confusion, frustration, any emotional response that proves they still have influence. Think about it. A narcissist doesn't just want control. They want evidence of control. They want to know they can still affect your emotions, still occupy your thoughts, still shape your behavior. That's why they provoke, criticize, manipulate, create drama, start conflicts, not always because they care about the issue itself, because they care about the reaction. But a super empath eventually learns something important. Not every invitation deserves a response. Not every accusation requires a defense. Not every insult deserves attention. And once they understand this, the game begins changing. The narcissist says something provocative. Nothing happens. The narcissist creates drama. No reaction. The narcissist tries guilt. No reaction. The narcissist tries anger. Still no reaction. Suddenly, the usual tactics stop working. And for a narcissist, that feels incredibly unsettling, because the emotional fuel they depend on starts disappearing. The second way a super empath destroys a narcissist is through radical self-awareness. Most people spend years trying to understand others. The super empath eventually turns that focus inward. They begin studying themselves, their triggers, their wounds, their insecurities, their patterns, their vulnerabilities. At first, this process is painful, because self-awareness requires honesty. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths. But over time, something remarkable happens. The empath becomes harder to manipulate. Why? Because manipulation often depends on unconscious weaknesses, unresolved fears, unhealed wounds, hidden insecurities. The narcissist searches for emotional openings, places where guilt can enter, places where shame can enter, places where self-doubt can enter. But the more self-aware the empath becomes, the fewer openings remain. The narcissist discovers that old tactics no longer work. The guilt trips fail, the emotional games fail, the confusion fails, because the empath now understands exactly what's happening. And awareness destroys manipulation faster than almost anything else. The third way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by refusing to compete. This is one of the most overlooked psychological shifts. Narcissists often view life as competition. Who is more important? Who is more successful? Who is more admired? Who has more control? Who wins? Who loses? Even relationships can become competitions. Arguments become competitions. Achievements become competitions. Attention becomes competition. everything becomes a struggle for superiority. But the super empath eventually steps out of the arena completely. They stop competing. They stop proving. They stop defending. They stop chasing approval. And when that happens, the narcissist loses something valuable, the game itself. You cannot defeat someone who refuses to play. You cannot control someone who no longer seeks your validation. You cannot manipulate someone who no longer needs your approval. The narcissist keeps trying to create competition. But the empath has already walked away. And that absence of participation becomes surprisingly powerful. The fourth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is through boundaries. Healthy boundaries may be one of the most threatening things a narcissist can encounter, because boundaries create limits. Limits on access, limits on control, limits on manipulation, limits on emotional exploitation. Early in life, many empaths struggle with boundaries. They want to help everyone, understand everyone, save everyone, fix everyone. Unfortunately, narcissists often recognize this immediately. They view excessive empathy as opportunity, but eventually the empath learns a difficult lesson. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Caring about others should never require abandoning yourself. Loving someone should never require losing yourself. Helping someone should never require sacrificing your emotional health. Once this lesson takes root, boundaries begin appearing. Firm boundaries, consistent boundaries, healthy boundaries, and the narcissist often reacts strongly. Why? Because boundaries expose expectations. They reveal who respected you and who merely benefited from your lack of limits. The moment boundaries appear, the relationship changes. Access becomes restricted. Control decreases. Influence weakens. And many narcissists cannot tolerate that shift. But perhaps the fifth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is the most powerful of all, because it has nothing to do with revenge, nothing to do with punishment, nothing to do with winning. In fact, it's the one thing narcissists never expect, the one thing that often affects them more deeply than confrontation, arguments, or conflict ever could. It's a transformation that occurs inside the empath, a transformation so profound that it changes the entire dynamic forever. Once it happens, the narcissist can no longer return the relationship to what it once was, no matter how hard they try, no matter what tactics they use, no matter how much manipulation they attempt. Because the empath becomes someone entirely different, someone stronger, someone wiser, someone emotionally free. And that final transformation is where the real story begins. Because when a super empath reaches that stage, the narcissist doesn't just lose control. They lose something they never imagined they could lose. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Because the fifth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by becoming emotionally free. This is the moment everything changes. Not when the empath argues harder, not when they expose the narcissist, not when they seek revenge, not when they finally say the perfect thing. Those moments may feel powerful, but they are not what truly shifts the balance. The real transformation happens when the narcissist no longer controls the empath's emotional world. When the empath wakes up one day and realizes something extraordinary, the narcissist is no longer the center of their thoughts, no longer the center of their decisions, no longer the center of their emotions, no longer the center of their life. And for a narcissist, this can be devastating, because narcissists often measure importance through attention. The more attention they occupy, the more significant they feel. The more emotional energy they consume, the more powerful they believe themselves to be. But emotional freedom removes that source of power. The empath stops obsessing, stops explaining, stops defending, stops chasing understanding, stops seeking validation, stops waiting for change. And in that moment, the narcissist loses access to something they once depended on: the empath's emotional investment. Many people think the greatest punishment for a narcissist is confrontation, exposure, public humiliation. But often the most powerful thing is indifference. Not cruel indifference, not bitterness, not hatred, peaceful indifference, the kind that comes from healing. the kind that comes from acceptance, the kind that says, I understand who you are, and I no longer need you to become someone else. That mindset changes everything, because narcissists are often prepared for conflict, prepared for arguments, prepared for resistance, prepared for emotional reactions. What they're not prepared for is emotional detachment. They expect the empath to remain engaged, to keep fighting, keep explaining, keep hoping, keep returning. When that cycle ends, the narcissist loses something they rarely anticipated losing: influence. And influence is often far more important to them than affection. Another reason emotional freedom affects narcissists so deeply is because it removes predictability. For years, they may have understood exactly how to provoke reactions, exactly how to trigger guilt, exactly how to create self-doubt, exactly how to regain attention. But healing changes the pattern. The old buttons stop working. The old strategies stop producing results. The old manipulations stop creating confusion. Suddenly they're dealing with someone unfamiliar, someone they no longer understand, someone who refuses to behave the way they used to. And this unpredictability creates enormous frustration, because control depends on predictability. When a person's behavior can no longer be predicted, control becomes much more difficult. One of the most fascinating things about super empaths is that their greatest strength often emerges from their greatest pain. Think about that for a moment. The betrayal that nearly broke them, the manipulation that exhausted them, the disappointment that shattered their trust, the heartbreak that left them questioning everything. These experiences hurt deeply, but they also teach. The empath begins noticing patterns, learning lessons, developing wisdom, building resilience, strengthening boundaries, and eventually, the very experiences designed to weaken them become the foundation of their growth. This is something many narcissists fail to anticipate. They assume pain will create dependence, confusion, submission. Instead, the empath transforms. The suffering becomes education. The wounds become awareness. The heartbreak becomes clarity, and clarity is incredibly difficult to manipulate. Another thing that often surprises narcissists is that super empaths stop seeking justice from them. This sounds strange because most people naturally want fairness, accountability, acknowledgement, closure. But over time, many super empaths discover a difficult truth. Some people will never provide those things. No matter how reasonable the request, no matter how clear the evidence, no matter how much harm occurred, waiting for accountability can become a prison. Waiting for understanding can become a trap. Waiting for closure can delay healing indefinitely. So the empath makes a powerful decision. They stop waiting. They create their own closure, their own peace, their own understanding. And when that happens, the narcissist loses another form of influence: the ability to keep the empath emotionally attached through unfinished business. This is one reason healed empaths often seem so different from who they used to be. They're no longer trying to force reality into a preferred outcome. They're accepting reality as it is. And acceptance creates freedom, not because reality becomes pleasant, because resistance finally ends. There is also something deeply threatening about self-respect, especially to people who benefited from your lack of it. This is another way super empaths transform the dynamic. They stop abandoning themselves. For years, they may have prioritized everyone else's needs, everyone else's emotions, everyone else's comfort, everyone else's approval, at their own expense. Then something changes. They begin treating themselves with the same compassion they've always offered others, the same patience, the same understanding, the same kindness. And once self-respect becomes established, manipulation becomes far more difficult, because self-respect changes decisions, changes standards, changes expectations, changes tolerance. The empath no longer accepts behavior they once excused, no longer ignores red flags they once rationalized, no longer sacrifices themselves to preserve unhealthy relationships. And this often creates conflict, not because the empath became selfish, because balance replaced imbalance. The relationship can no longer function the way it once did. Many narcissists interpret this transformation incorrectly. They assume the empath became cold, cruel, selfish, uncaring. But that's rarely what's happening. What's actually happening is that the empath finally extended empathy inward, toward themselves, for perhaps the first time, and that changes everything. Another powerful shift occurs when super empaths stop trying to rescue people. This lesson takes years for many individuals to learn. Empaths naturally see potential, possibility, hidden goodness, future growth. They look beyond current behavior and imagine who someone could become. This can be beautiful, but it can also become dangerous, because relationships must be based on reality, not potential. Reality, not promises. Reality, not possibilities. When empaths finally accept this, they stop trying to save people who don't want to save themselves. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs. They stop confusing compassion with obligation. And suddenly, enormous amounts of emotional energy become available. Energy that can now be invested in healthier places, healthier relationships, healthier goals, healthier experiences. This is another reason narcissists lose influence. The empath's attention is no longer trapped, no longer consumed, no longer available for endless emotional cycles. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is that super empaths rarely set out to destroy narcissists. That was never the goal. The narcissist experiences it as destruction because their usual sources of control disappear. But from the empath's perspective, something very different is happening. They're simply growing, healing, learning, awakening, evolving. The narcissist loses power because the empath stops surrendering it. Not because they become aggressive, not because they become manipulative, not because they seek revenge, because they become whole. And wholeness is difficult to control. A person who knows their worth is difficult to manipulate. A person comfortable being alone is difficult to threaten. A person who trusts themselves is difficult to confuse. A person who respects themselves is difficult to exploit. A person who has healed is difficult to trap. That is the true power of a super empath. Not the ability to destroy others, the ability to reclaim themselves. And once that happens, everything changes. The narcissist may continue playing the same games, using the same tactics, creating the same drama, but the empath is no longer participating, and a game cannot continue when only one person is playing. In the end, the greatest victory is not watching a narcissist lose. It's reaching a point where their victory or defeat no longer determines your happiness, where their approval no longer determines your value, where their behavior no longer controls your emotions, where their presence no longer defines your future. That is emotional freedom. That is healing. That is growth. And that is why the super empath's greatest weapon has never been revenge. It's transformation. Because while narcissists spend years trying to control the world around them, the super empath eventually learns something far more powerful: how to master the world within. And once that happens, there is very little anyone can take away from them, including the narcissist who once believed they had all the power.